So I am so excited to have my friend Sonia here of Leeward REI. Sonia is going to talk in terms of what multifamily means, what it is, and again, just kind of like the other alternative asset classes. What are the advantages, disadvantages, what you should be looking for, and we'll kind of get into it. But like every other video, neither Sonia nor I are your financial advisors. I may or may not have invested with Sonia my own money. I may or may not have lost money with Sonia. So please do your own research and understand any asset class that you decide to invest in. There is always risk. This is to be used for educational and entertainment purposes only. So Sonia, thank you for being here today. And just for people to understand your backstory a little bit, how did you get to where you are right now?
Well, thank you for having me, Howie. I was actually trained as a lawyer. I went to law school and I worked for a big accounting company doing mergers and acquisitions in their tax department, mergers and acquisition research, and assisting companies to do that. And it became pretty obvious that I wasn't really that great at it, you could say. I did okay. I was hobbling along, but I didn't thoroughly enjoy it. And I knew there was another side to me that I could really flourish in. And that decision came into play when I had my daughter, and I went back to work, and I said, "Oh man, this is not worth the sacrifice that I have to make to be away from my daughter, kids. I plan to have more." So I just didn't see that part of life working out. So I decided to get into real estate. I quit my job and I bought a house to what you call now a flip. Back then, I don't think such term existed. I just thought that I could make a not so great looking house into a really good looking house, which most people didn't seem to be able to see beyond what's in front of their eyes. So I did that, and I did a lot of the work myself by hiring subcontractors and such, designing myself, and it was pretty fun, and I made some money. But I realized rehabbing homes has a lot of risks because you really don't know what your budget's going to be, what you're going to have to do to a house until you opened up the walls. So that's a lot of risk. So I decided to build brand new homes. And so that way, you know exactly how much you're going to need, what you're going to get into, what you're going to build, how you're going to change things if you have to. You don't have to try to fit an old model, which is in turn what costs a lot of money. So I developed big custom homes, and I was having fun doing that. Made a lot of good contacts, loved working with contractors, designing and producing something I thought was a functional family homes that were lacking. And then 2008, 2009 hit, and virtually all the capital, so the financing for building spec homes and things like that, disappeared. So that's when I decided to invest in multifamily because banks were still lending money to acquire apartment buildings. And I think the banks were doing that because there's tangible and seizable cash flow with the properties like multifamily. There's renters there paying rent. You could do due diligence into what the expenses are. For the most part, you can kind of predict what those are with the past experiences and past records. They don't change very much. And so the banks were still willing to lend for me to buy those multifamily. So I started buying smaller properties, 8-unit, 10-unit buildings that turned into a bigger and bigger portfolio. And I start setting my eye higher and higher into bigger properties, which in turn prompted me to invite my family and friends to invest together, which in turn is what syndication basically is. Right? You pull your money together to buy a bigger building. So that's how I got into multifamily, and I'm still doing that to this day.
Okay, and just to to step back a second, multifamily is literally multiple families under one roof. So apartment buildings, apartment complexes instead of single family homes. And you like multifamily, and from what I've gathered, and is just that you've got more people where it's more rent, where if you rent out a single family home, it's either it's occupied or it's not occupied. So it's either you're making
That's
money or
right.
you're at zero.
That's right.
So I'm
Pretty
guessing
simple.
that, yeah, so that's probably the greatest strength in terms of multifamily. What do you see as the biggest risk in terms of looking at multifamily?
Well, my answer would have been very different before this coronavirus epidemic hit. So I'll try to refer back to that date. I think the biggest risk to multifamily is things like the whole region or the city being emptied out because of a job loss, or a big industry sector is no longer booming. Or if you take an example of city like Detroit, I mean, the whole city died when the auto industry died. And so when you have a multifamily, a big investment like that in a city like that, and something like that happens, well, that's your biggest risk. You can't really revive from that until maybe a long time later. I mean, Detroit is now being repositioned, but it took a really, really long time. And so you can't really survive something like that when you have multifamily.
Uh,
So I think the biggest risk is not having the jobs that people who live in that complex or property. And if that job source is a single industry or a single source, then your risk is bigger.
okay. And in terms of investors, because you mentioned what a syndication is pooling money together to acquire an asset. Who is your typical investor these days?
My typical investors are people who want some extra cash flow or want to invest in the future appreciation of the building. I live in California, and a lot of my investments have been in California, although not of late. And so appreciation is a big game in multifamily or real estate investment, right? So a lot of doctors and lawyers, they don't have the bandwidth or the knowledge to go out and buy a property and manage it themselves, especially, and do all the proper due diligence prior to acquiring. So a lot of those investors want to invest in real estate, but they can't really do it by themselves. And so I tend to see a lot of those professionals around me wanting to invest in real estate.
Got it. When you acquire a property, what is the timeline that you're usually holding that property for?
Well, I think it depends what your end game is. If you're trying to build your portfolio, I mean, I don't, I don't almost never feel the need to sell it, because you can't exit your capital that you initially invested into it by refinancing. And so let's say you have $1 million equity in a building, and but that means you have, the building value could be 7 or 8 million. And if the building value appreciates to 10 million, well, you could refinance, and then you could get your $1 million out that you initially invested in, and then invest it into something else. So unless you have a reason to not wanting to own that building for whatever reason, let's say you want to exchange it into a bigger building using 1031 exchange, or you no longer want to deal with it, or you want to do something different, then I guess, it's just your personal situation. But I don't really feel the need to sell a multifamily building, at least in populated area like California, Northern California. I did hear from a colleague in Texas who invests in multifamilies, and he likes selling his properties when the building hits about 40 years of age, 40 or 50 years of age. And he likes that time frame, because that's when you have to start putting some real money into renovating the building or modernizing it. But here in California, the land value is so high that it appreciates over time. And if building was standing there for last 40, 50 years, well, chances are the land appreciated quite a bit. And so you can get your capital out again by refinancing, and the cash flow would also increase accordingly, since hopefully the rent will have gone up in time also. So I think it's just kind of given, it just depends on your personal situation and what you wanted to get out of that investment.
Okay. So I'm going to preface this with neither you nor I are CPAs, but I know people like to get into real estate because there are certain tax advantages that that asset class has. Can you kind of touch on just a couple of them on a high level of what the tax advantages are?
Okay, I'll try to stay at the high level because this is one of my favorite topics. I did practice tax when I was an attorney, so I have a little bit of advantage. And I just sometimes cannot believe how much tax advantages real estate investing enjoys. It's people almost sometimes don't even believe it, but it's true. The biggest advantage in investing real property, real estate, is, I think it really is the tax advantage. The reason being, when you purchase or acquire a piece of real estate, let's say a 10 unit apartment building. Well, it's considered, as we all know, an apartment building appreciates in value, whether because people pay higher rent year after year, or because the land appreciates, and all of that together brings up the value of the property. Well, for tax purposes, a piece of real estate is considered a depreciating asset. So just like when you buy a car, you buy a brand new car and then you drive it off the lot, and that car value starts depreciating over time. That's how the tax law treats real estate, when in fact, in reality, it appreciates in value. So while you're collecting more tax and enjoying your appreciation on your tax return, you're taking deductions for the depreciated value of that piece of property over time. So when you have an income, your depreciated value of that real estate can offset that income. And so you're virtually enjoying a tax-free cash flow during the time you own that building. Now, it does get recaptured when you actually sell the building, but there's different things you could do to mitigate that recapture. And also, there's also the 1031 exchange, which is another huge benefit. And what 1031 exchange allows you to do as an investor is, say you have a piece of property that appreciated in value, and if you sold it, you would recognize, $1 million income or what have you, capital gains. But if you put that gain into another piece of investment property, maybe perhaps that's bigger property than you previously owned, as long as you put all of your gains and base into that in the loan value, it's going to get a little complicated if I get into every detail, but you have the ability to indefinitely push over that gain until you dispose of that other asset that you just acquired. So you can do this foreseeably generations down the line. And I do know people who actually become sort of a prisoner to this because they can't touch it since the gains have been deferred generation after generation. So they face huge tax consequences. But if you're not paying capital gains for the gains you have, and you're able to immediately invest that into another property, I mean, your compounding effect is so huge, and you're able to really speed up building your assets. So I would say those two are the biggest tax advantages. There are others, especially with the new tax act that Trump enacted in 2017. There's a lot of other advantages that came with that Reform Act as well. But I would say over time, those two are the biggest tax advantages that you're going to enjoy right off the get-go.
Yeah. Do you only work with accredited investors?
I have, just because it's difficult not to, but I have plans to work with non-credited investors, and it just has to do with, I got to plan it so that I can take in non-credited investors by filing the right type of securities filings or exemptions applications and such. So I have only worked with accredited, but my plan is to work with non-accredited as well.
Okay. And currently, what's the minimum investment to invest with Leeward?
We've generally done $100,000 minimum investments.
Okay. Now, knowing that the tax advantages that you have with real estate, do you only accept after-tax money, or have people invested with you with self-directed IRAs?
We have capacity to accept self-directed IRAs. We haven't quite set it up because most of our investors have not tapped into that resource yet, but we certainly can. It's not that hard for us to accept self-directed IRA monies.
Okay. And I know past performance is no guarantee of future results, and there are, many, many different operators within the multifamily class, but can you at least kind of give an expected range of returns of what people should be thinking of, both, if it's possible, either cash flow wise so that they can live now, or just from a total return perspective? What is a good number to shoot for?
Well, there's a specific number that I target, and I know other operators have targeted different numbers, and it also depends on how risky the investment is. So I tend to target 8 to 9% return cash flow income dividends to the investors over the life of while we're holding the asset.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also target another 2 or 3% in appreciation in addition to the 8 or 9% cash flow. So hopefully more, but we target total 12 to 15% return, annualized return for the property. And again, 8 or 9% of that comes from the cash flow.
Okay. So you're kind of enjoying, let's call it at least your personal targets, enjoying about 60% of the gains now, 40% on the back end type of idea.
Yeah, maybe it's more like 70 or 30 or 60, 40, but yeah, depending on the type of property, math, and whether we're doing more value add versus buying an existing building that's running pretty smoothly the way it is. So it'll differ a little bit depending on those qualities and risk factors.
Perfect. Sonia, any parting words?
To your investors and audience?
Yeah. Just in terms of, this is designed in terms of, I hope people optimize their personal cash flow. If they have a business, get them into systems in terms of knowing that their business is running profitably. Mm-hmm. And between those two things, now they've got excess money to be able to invest for cash flow. So this is the target audience. That's who we're shooting for. So any final words in terms of that audience?
Okay, well, I would say that I obviously love real estate. I love what it can do for people in terms of building their wealth and giving passive income. I think it's a great place for people to invest into. And unfortunately, it does take some energy and knowledge. And if you don't have time for it yourself, I would say find an operator that you trust, who's very conservative, who's willing to work really hard for you. Because one of the advantage of real estate, aside from the cash flow and the appreciation, is that if the ownership, if the person who's operating the multifamily or the apartment building works hard enough, I mean, unless you chose the wrong property in the first place and something happens like Detroit happened, I guess you can't do that much. But if you chose the right place, you almost can't lose money if the person who's operating it is working hard enough and paying attention and running a tight ship. So I consider it one of the most safest investment, and obviously very rewarding in terms of cash flow, leveraging is available, tax advantages available. It's very flexible in terms of what you can or cannot do. So I would encourage everybody to look into it. Don't get overwhelmed and just study into it. It's also not rocket science. It's really not that hard. But if you don't have time to do it yourself, there's ways to do it by partnering with somebody you trust and knows who can do a good job for you. So I would say look into it, understand the advantages, get excited about it, and just do it.
Awesome. How can people contact you, Sonia?
People can find me on my website, Leeward, REI.com. REI stands for real estate income. I'm sorry, realestateinvestment.com. I misstated my company's name. I've also recently started a video show, a sort of a video blog with a partner. It's called Women Creating Wealth Together. We have a website called womencreatingwealthtogether.com. We also have a Facebook page, so you can find our contact information there. And on that show, we just make it a comfortable forum for women and beginning investors to just come listen to the education we try to provide and just sharing information and experiences. So that could also be another place where your listeners could find my contact information. And we always encourage questions and comments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you so much for your time today, and stay safe in these crazy times.
Thank you, Howard. You do the same.